Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The sound behind the walls. The rain poured heavily as Sarah and Daniel's car finally turned onto the gravel road leading to their new home. Towering trees lined both sides of the narrow path, their branches swaying violently in the wind, casting eerie shadows under the dim glow of the car's headlights. "This place looks straight out of a horror movie," Sarah muttered, hugging herself against the cold. Daniel chuckled, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "Come on, it's just an old house. It has character." Sarah wasn't convinced. Ever since they first saw the listing online, something about the house had unsettled her. It wasn't just its age, over 100 years old, or the way it stood alone, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was something deeper, something unspoken. But Daniel had fallen in love with it instantly. "Think about it," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "A house this big, at this price, it's a steal. Besides, we can finally start our lives away from the noise of the city." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to think of this as a fresh start, a place where they could build a future. But as the house came into view through the sheets of rain, her stomach twisted into knots. It was massive, with towering stone walls that had turned dark with age. Ivy crawled up its sides, wrapping around its wooden shutters like fingers clawing at its surface. The front door stood tall and imposing, a relic from another time. Lightning flashed, illuminating the house in a stark white glow for a brief moment, before plunging everything back into darkness. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Daniel pulled the car up to the front and killed the engine. "Welcome home," he said, grinning as he turned to her. Sarah forced a smile, but as she stepped out into the rain, the feeling of being watched crept over her. The house loomed above them, silent and waiting, and deep within its walls, something stirred. The air inside the house was thick with dust and the faint scent of old wood. Sarah wrinkled her nose as she stepped into the grand foyer, her eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by time. The wooden floor creaked under her feet, as if groaning in protest at their presence. Daniel flicked the light switch near the entrance, and a warm yellow glow filled the space. "See? Cozy?" he said, setting down their bags. Sarah scanned the room. The house was fully furnished, just as the real estate agent had promised. Antique furniture lined the walls, an old grandfather clock stood in the corner, and a long staircase led up to the second floor. But despite its beauty, something about the place felt off. They explored the house, moving from room to room. The living room had an enormous fireplace, its mantel adorned with old photographs, faces long forgotten. The dining room featured a heavy oak table, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The kitchen, though outdated, had a certain rustic charm. Upstairs, the hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with closed doors. Sarah hesitated before opening the one leading to their bedroom. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house. The bed, covered in a white sheet, sat in the center of the room, facing an old wardrobe with a full-length mirror. Daniel flopped onto the bed. "Not bad," he said, yawning. "We'll get used to it." Sarah wasn't sure. Something about the house made her skin crawl. She changed into her nightgown and slipped under the blankets beside Daniel, listening to the sound of the rain against the windows. Then, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it. A faint scratching. It was coming from the walls. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound was light, almost too soft to notice, like fingernails dragging against wood. She turned to Daniel, but he was already asleep. For several minutes, she lay there, heart pounding, listening. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Sarah exhaled shakily. Maybe it was just the old pipes, or mice. That had to be it. She closed her eyes, willing herself to ignore it. But deep inside, a feeling of dread began to settle in her chest. Somewhere behind the walls, something was awake. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting long beams of light across the wooden floor. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She hadn't slept well. The scratching sound from the walls had faded sometime in the night, but the unease it left behind lingered in her chest. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed perfectly fine. He hummed to himself as he unpacked boxes, occasionally glancing at her with a teasing smile. "Rough first night?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "I heard something, in the walls. The sound," Daniel chuckled. "Old house noises. Probably just rats or something." Sarah wanted to believe him, but something about the sound had felt deliberate. Too slow, too rhythmic to be random. She spent the day trying to push the thought away, keeping herself busy with unpacking. As she moved through the house, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she passed a mirror, she found herself glancing into it, half expecting to see something standing behind her. But each time, it was just her own reflection, tired and pale. That evening, as they settled in for their second night, the house was eerily quiet. No rain, no wind, just an unnatural stillness that made Sarah's skin prickle. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then it started again, the scratching, slow, deliberate, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just scratching. It was followed by a whisper, a faint, breathy voice, muffled by the walls. Sarah froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she strained to hear. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but they were there. A childlike whisper, fragile and distant, like someone trapped behind layers of wood and stone. Sarah shot up in bed, her breath caught in her throat. She turned to Daniel and shook his shoulder. "Daniel, wake up." He groaned, half asleep. "What?" "Listen," she hissed. Daniel sighed but sat up, rubbing his face. He stayed silent for a moment, listening. Nothing. Sarah's hands trembled. "I swear I heard something." Daniel exhaled heavily and pulled her close. "You're just tired. Moving is stressful. Let's get some sleep, okay?" Sarah wanted to argue, but the whispering had stopped. The house was silent again. Reluctantly, she lay back down. But long after Daniel drifted off, Sarah kept her eyes open, her ears tuned to the walls. Something was there, and it wanted to be heard. The next morning, Sarah felt like a ghost of herself, exhausted, paranoid, and on edge. The whispering had been real, she was sure of it. But every time she tried to bring it up, Daniel would wave it off, assuring her that old houses made strange noises. By noon, she had enough of feeling helpless. If something was making noises inside the walls, she was going to find out what it was. Armed with a flashlight and a determination she didn't quite feel, Sarah started searching the house. She tapped against the walls, pressing her ear to them, trying to figure out if any part of the house sounded hollow. but the walls were solid stone and thick wood. Nothing should be inside them. Then, in the hallway near the staircase, her fingers brushed against something strange. A seam. The wallpaper had a barely noticeable slit running vertically down the center. Sarah's breath hitched as she traced it with her fingertips. It was too straight to be damage. It looked intentional. A hidden panel. Her heart pounded. She hesitated for only a second before pressing her palm against it. At first, nothing happened. Then, click. The wall shifted slightly. Sarah gasped as she pushed, and with some resistance, the hidden panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway behind it. A damp, musty smell rushed out, as if the air inside had been trapped for decades. She turned back, half expecting Daniel to be standing there, but he was still outside, working on the yard. Sarah swallowed hard. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to close the panel and pretend she never found it. But something stronger, curiosity, fear, or maybe something else, drove her forward. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the narrow space beyond the wall. The passage was small, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. The walls were rough, unfinished wood, with deep scratches marring the surface, as if something had clawed at them, desperate to escape. Sarah's breathing quickened. She stepped inside. The passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the house, past the point where any normal room should have been. The air grew colder, the smell of decay thickening. Then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. A door. A small rotting wooden door at the end of the passage. The edges were splintered, the hinges rusted with age. It looked old, far older than the rest of the house. Sarah hesitated. Every part of her screamed, "Don't open it." But before she could decide, a sound came from the other side. A whisper. "Please, help me." Sarah's blood turned to ice. And then, bang. Something slammed against the door from the inside. She stumbled backward, heart hammering in her chest. The whispering turned frantic, layered voices overlapping each other in a desperate chorus. The door rattled violently, as if someone was trying to break through. Sarah turned and ran. She burst out of the passage, slamming the hidden panel shut behind her. The house fell silent again, but she knew, without a doubt, she had found something that was never meant to be found. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind racing with what she had seen. The hidden passage, the rotting door, the whisper. She wanted to tell Daniel, but how could she explain what she had heard without sounding insane? Instead, she spent the afternoon researching the house. She dug through old newspapers online, searching for anything unusual about the property. It had stood for over 100 years, passed between multiple owners. Some had sold it quickly. Others had disappeared from public records entirely. Then she found something. A faded black and white photograph in an article dated 1912. The picture showed a family standing in front of the house. A man, a woman, and a young girl, no older than 7. The parents looked stiff and formal, but the little girl. Something about her made Sarah uneasy. Her wide eyes stared directly into the camera. Hollow, empty. Sarah read the article. The house had once belonged to a man named Victor Halloway, a wealthy but reclusive figure. The girl in the photo was his daughter, Eleanor Halloway. The article only mentioned her once. Then she was never seen or heard from again. No death certificate, no record of her growing up. Just gone. Sarah's fingers trembled over the keyboard. Was she the one whispering from behind the door? She shut the laptop and stood abruptly, She needed to get out of the house. As she stepped into the hallway, something made her freeze. The air was wrong, heavier, stiller. Then, from the shadows near the staircase, a giggle, software, childlike. Sarah's heart stopped. She spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. Then, a cold breeze brushed past her. She gasped, stepping backward. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the giggle faded, swallowed by silence. Something was here, watching her. She ran outside, the fresh air hitting her like a slap. Daniel looked up from the garden, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You okay?" Sarah stared at him, struggling to find the words. How could he not feel it? Before she could speak, the sound of a door creaking made her blood turn to ice. It came from inside the house, the hidden passage. Sarah turned slowly. The panel she had closed was now slightly open. Something inside was waiting. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every muscle in her body tense. The house felt different, alive. Daniel was fast asleep beside her, breathing evenly, oblivious to the weight pressing down on the air. Sarah wanted to wake him, to tell him everything. The hidden passage, the door, the giggle, the photograph of Eleanor Halloway. But fear kept her silent. She turned onto her side, facing the bedroom door. The hallway outside was pitch black. Then, creak. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound came from the hallway, a floorboard groaning under the weight of something or someone. Sarah froze, her body paralyzed. She strained her ears. Silence. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was just the old house shifting, settling into itself. Creak. Closer this time. Sarah's blood ran cold. Someone was in the house. She slowly sat up, heart hammering. She glanced at Daniel, but he didn't stir. Then, from beyond the doorway, tap, tap, tap. Soft footsteps, small, like a child's. Sarah's fingers dug into the blanket. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm. It's not real. You're imagining this. Then, the bedroom door moved. Not much. Just a tiny shift, like something was pressing against it from the other side. A whisper followed. "Sarah." Her stomach dropped. That voice, soft, fragile, almost pleading. She wanted to scream, to wake Daniel, to run. But she couldn't move. Then through the crack in the doorway, she saw it. A shadow, small, still, watching. Sarah's entire body went numb. Then bang! The bedroom door slammed shut on its own. The sound jolted Daniel awake. He shot up. What the hell was that? Sarah couldn't answer. She was still staring at the door, her pulse racing. Daniel swung his legs over the bed and got up, his movements groggy but alert. He grabbed the doorknob and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Nothing. But Sarah knew. She hadn't imagined it. Something had been standing there, watching her, calling her name. And for the first time since moving in, she knew she wasn't safe. Sarah refused to sleep after what she had seen. Even though Daniel tried to convince her it was just a nightmare, she knew the truth. Someone, something, had been standing outside their bedroom door. She spent the next morning wandering the house, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Every mirror, every dark corner, every closed door felt like it was hiding something. Then, her eyes drifted back to the hallway, the place where she had discovered the hidden panel. The panel was still slightly open. A cold weight settled in her stomach. She had closed it. She was sure. Something had opened it again. Sarah swallowed hard. She had two choices: run or find out the truth. She chose the second. Grabbing her flashlight, she stepped forward and pulled the panel open, revealing the dark passageway behind it. The stale, rotting air hit her immediately, thick with dust and something foul. She hesitated, then forced herself inside. The passage was tighter than she remembered, the walls pressing in on her. The deep scratches in the wood looked fresher this time, as if someone had been clawing at them recently. Sarah moved forward, her breath quick and shallow. The air grew colder. The silence felt heavy, thick with unseen eyes. Then she saw it again, the door at the end of the passage. It looked worse than before. The wood was splintered, the rusted hinges barely holding it together. Sarah raised her hand, about to touch the doorknob. But before she could, she noticed something on the ground. A small porcelain doll. It sat upright, its white dress yellowed with age, its face cracked down the middle. The eyes, deep, hollow holes, stared straight at her. Sarah's stomach twisted. She bent down slowly, reaching for the doll. Then it moved, just the tiniest twitch, a shift of its tiny hand. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, her flashlight shaking wildly. And then the whispering started again, soft at first, faint, her voice barely above a breath. "Please, don't leave me." Sarah turned and ran. Because as she turned to walk away, she saw something in the reflection of the hallway mirror. The panel had slid open, just a crack, and in the darkness, two hollow eyes were watching her. Sarah didn't tell Daniel about what had happened in the hidden passage. She wanted to, but every time she tried, the words got stuck in her throat. Would he even believe her? So instead, she spent the rest of the day trying to act normal. She stayed close to Daniel, refusing to be alone in any part of the house. She avoided the hallway, avoided looking in mirrors, avoided thinking about the doll with its hollow, staring eyes. But that night, the house refused to let her forget. She woke to a sound, not the scratching, not the whispering. This time, it was Daniel. He was standing at the foot of the bed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Daniel," she whispered. He didn't answer. He was staring at the bedroom door, completely still. Her stomach clenched. "Daniel, what are you doing?" Then he spoke. "They're watching," he murmured. His voice was flat, empty, not his. Sarah's blood ran cold. She sat up slowly. "Who's watching?" Daniel blinked. He shook his head suddenly, as if snapping out of a trance. Then he turned to her, confused. "Sarah, why are you awake?" She stared at him. "You were just..." She stopped herself. He doesn't remember. Daniel frowned. "I was asleep." "No," Sarah whispered. "You were standing there. You said something." Daniel rubbed his face. "I don't remember anything." Sarah swallowed. Her hands trembled as she reached for him. Then, creak. The bedroom door slowly swung open on its own. Sarah and Daniel both froze. The hallway was pitch black. A wave of ice washed over Sarah's skin. She knew what was out there. Daniel cursed under his breath. He stood up, grabbed his phone, and turned on the flashlight. "Stay here." "No," Sarah said immediately, getting up too. "I'm coming with you." Daniel sighed but didn't argue. Together, they stepped into the hallway, the phone's light barely cutting through the darkness. Then, Sarah felt it. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen, and that's when Daniel stopped. His flashlight was pointed at the mirror at the end of the hall. His entire body stiffened. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what he saw. A small girl stood behind them in the reflection, pale, hollow eyes, mouth slightly open. Eleanor Holloway. Sarah spun around. The hallway was empty. She turned back to the mirror. The girl was still there. And then, ever so slowly, Eleanor smiled. The flashlight flickered, and everything went dark. The flashlight flickered back to life a second later, but by then, the mirror was empty. Sarah and Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, their breath ragged. "You saw her," Sarah whispered, gripping Daniel's arm. "You saw her." Daniel nodded slowly. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of this house." But deep inside, Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Eleanor Holloway wasn't just a ghost haunting this house. She was trapped here, and she didn't want them to leave. And worse, she wasn't alone. The whispering returned, software, distant, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Sarah turned toward the hidden panel in the hallway. It was wide open now. The passage behind it was darker than ever, almost swallowing the light from Daniel's phone. A deep chill crawled up her spine. Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Don't." But it was too late. She knew where she had to go. "Sarah," she stepped inside. The whispering grew louder, urgent, desperate. She followed the narrow passage, past the deep scratches in the wood, past the doll still sitting on the floor, until she reached the rotting door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She reached out and pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Rot, decay, death. Sarah gagged, covering her nose as her flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Then she saw them. Bodies. Small, shriveled, buried beneath the floorboards. Some were just bones. Others still had scraps of old clothing clinging to them. And at the center, a tiny, rotting skeleton wearing a white dress. Sarah's stomach lurched. The air pressed in around her, thick with something evil. Then she heard it. A whisper right next to her ear. "He put me here." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The whispering voices overlapped, growing frantic, filling the tiny space with desperate cries. "He put us here. He put us here. He put us here." Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. And then, for the first time, Eleanor spoke clearly. "He never left." Sarah's pulse stopped. Bang! The door behind her slammed shut, and in the darkness, something moved. Sarah's flashlight flickered. The air inside the hidden room turned suffocating, pressing against her like her body locked up. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Then, the whisper stopped. A single voice cut through the silence. Deep, raspy, male. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah spun around and saw him. A figure towered in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness. His form was twisted, unnatural, his limbs too long, his head tilted at an odd angle. He reeked of rot and something worse, malice. Victor Holloway, the man who had buried Eleanor beneath the floor. He never left. Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows around him shifted, moving toward her, reaching. Suddenly, bang, bang, bang. Someone was pounding on the door from the other side. "Sarah, open the door." Daniel. Sarah snapped out of her paralysis and lunged for the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder. Victor's voice slithered through the dark. "She's mine," Sarah screamed. Then the floor collapsed beneath her. She fell, crashing into darkness. Sarah woke to Daniel shaking her. She was on the hallway floor. The hidden panel was gone. No passage, no door, no bodies, just wall. Daniel pulled her into his arms. "You disappeared. I heard you screaming. And then you were just gone." Sarah turned, staring at the wall where the passage had been. "It was real," she whispered. Daniel didn't argue. He had seen Eleanor. They packed their bags that night, and as they drove away, Sarah looked back at the house one last time. A figure stood in the upstairs window. Not Eleanor, him. Victor watched them leave, and as the house faded into the distance, Sarah heard a whisper in the wind. "I'll be waiting." Story 2. The Woman Who Smiles Too Wide. Ethan had always believed that every town had its myths. Some were harmless, tales of ghostly whispers in old houses, shadowy figures lurking in the woods. Others were meant to keep children in line, warning them not to stray too far after dark. But when he moved to Black Hollow, he quickly realized that some stories refused to be just stories. His first week in town was uneventful. He had moved into a small, slightly outdated apartment complex on the edge of town, a place where the floorboards creaked no matter how carefully he walked. The windows rattled at night, even when the air was still, but he told himself it was nothing. Then he met Mrs. Alder. She was the kind of old woman who had lived in the same place for so long that she had become part of it. Her sharp blue eyes had seen things she refused to say out loud, but hinted at in the way her lips pressed together when she spoke of the past. Ethan often found her sitting in a rocking chair outside her unit, wrapped in a heavy shawl, no matter the weather. "You're new," she said one evening as Ethan passed by. He nodded, pausing. "Yeah, just moved in." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she exhaled through her nose. "Be careful at night, boy." Ethan chuckled. "Is this about the break-ins? I read about those in the town's paper." Mrs. Alder shook her head, her thin lips pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, not burglars. Worse things than that." Ethan frowned. "Like what?" For the first time, her voice dropped to a whisper. "You ever hear about the woman who smiles too wide?" Ethan hesitated. "No, but that sounds like a campfire story." Mrs. Alder didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. "She's real," she said, voice firm. "She's been here longer than me, longer than anyone. You see her standing under a streetlight, staring at you with that god-awful grin. You keep walking, and whatever you do, don't smile back." Ethan wanted to joke, to ask if she was trying to scare him, but something in the way she gripped her shawl, knuckles white, fingers trembling, told him she wasn't just trying to entertain a newcomer. That night, Ethan locked his door and shut his windows tight. He wasn't scared. Not really. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Mrs. Alder's words echoed in his head. "She's been here longer than me, longer than anyone." He tried to sleep, but for the first time since moving in, he felt like someone was watching him. The week passed without incident. Ethan settled into his new job, stocked his kitchen with cheap groceries, and got used to the eerie quiet of Black Hollow after dark. The town was nothing like the city he had come from. Here, the streets emptied early, and the silence stretched thick and suffocating. He told himself Mrs. Alder's warning was nothing but an old woman's paranoia. Yet, every night before bed, he found himself double-checking his locks, peering through the curtains at the dimly lit street below. Then came Friday night. Ethan had worked late, staying behind at the office to meet a deadline. By the time he packed his things and stepped outside, the streets were nearly deserted. Story 2. The Woman Who Smiles Too Wide. Ethan had always believed that every town had its myths. Some were harmless, tales of ghostly whispers in old houses, shadowy figures lurking in the woods. Others were meant to keep children in line, warning them not to stray too far after dark. But when he moved to Black Hollow, he quickly realized that some stories refused to be just stories. His first week in town was uneventful. He had moved into a small, slightly outdated apartment complex on the edge of town, a place where the floorboards creaked no matter how carefully he walked. The windows rattled at night, even when the air was still, but he told himself it was nothing. Then he met Mrs. Alder. She was the kind of old woman who had lived in the same place for so long that she had become part of it. Her sharp blue eyes had seen things she refused to say out loud, but hinted at in the way her lips pressed together when she spoke of the past. Ethan often found her sitting in a rocking chair outside her unit, wrapped in a heavy shawl, no matter the weather. "You're new," she said one evening as Ethan passed by. He nodded, pausing. "Yeah, just moved in." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she exhaled through her nose. "Be careful at night, boy." Ethan chuckled. "Is this about the break-ins? I read about those in the town's paper." Mrs. Alder shook her head, her thin lips pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, not burglars. Worse things than that." Ethan frowned. "Like what?" For the first time, her voice dropped to a whisper. "You ever hear about the woman who smiles too wide?" Ethan hesitated. "No, but that sounds like a campfire story." Mrs. Alder didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. "She's real," she said, voice firm. "She's been here longer than me, longer than anyone. You see her standing under a streetlight, staring at you with that god-awful grin. You keep the town's single bar still buzzed with faint laughter. But beyond that, Black Hollow felt abandoned. His apartment was only a 10-minute walk away. He considered calling a cab, but it felt unnecessary. Besides, he wasn't scared. He set off down the empty sidewalk, the only sound his own footsteps echoing against the brick buildings. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though the sky remained dry. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, jittery shadows on the pavement. As he passed the old church, a chill ran down his spine. A streetlight up ahead buzzed loudly, then flickered out completely. For a brief moment, darkness swallowed the road. Then the light sputtered back to life, and she was there. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. She stood at the edge of the light, facing him, her silhouette still. The woman was tall and thin, her long black hair cascading down her shoulders, motionless despite the faint breeze. She took a step forward, and the dim glow revealed her face. Ethan's breath hitched. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dark, but it was her mouth that froze him in place. A grin stretched across her face, too wide, too unnatural. Lips pulled back so far it seemed as if the corners would split open. Her teeth gleamed white and perfectly straight, but there was something deeply wrong about them, as if they didn't belong in a human mouth. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen, as if the air around him had thickened, holding him in place. Then she spoke. "Smile with me." Her voice was soft, almost musical, but layered, as if more than one voice spoke at once. It was both inviting and terrifying, a sound that slithered into his mind and wrapped around his thoughts. Ethan's lips twitched involuntarily. A part of him, a deep primal part, felt the urge to smile back. Number. He clenched his fists. He didn't know why, but he felt it in his bones. If he smiled, something terrible would happen. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head, a lesson from childhood. When fear grips you, act as if you see nothing. Ethan forced himself to move, step, one foot in front of the other. He focused on the pavement, his breath ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. "She's not real, just keep walking." The woman didn't move, but her voice followed him, curling around his brain like smoke. "Smile with me." He didn't look back. He reached his apartment, fumbling with his keys, slamming the door behind him. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the wood, listening. Silence. Slowly, He crept to the window and peeked outside. The street light was still flickering. The road was empty. She was gone. But Ethan knew deep in his gut that it wasn't over. She had seen him. And now she wouldn't forget. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The too wide grin, the hollow black eyes, the way her voice slithered through his skull like a whispered command. Smile with me. It replayed over and over, like a broken record looping in his mind. By morning, he convinced himself it had been a hallucination. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress, or just the power of suggestion. He had let Mrs. Alder's warning get to him, and his mind had turned an empty street into something monstrous. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched lingered, even in the daylight. Determined to shake the paranoia, Ethan did something he hadn't done since arriving in Black Hollow. He visited the town library. It was small, old, and smelled of dust and forgotten stories. The librarian, a frail woman with round glasses and thinning grey hair, barely looked up when he entered. Ethan went straight to the newspaper archives. If this woman was real, if others had seen her, there had to be something. A story, a police report, anything. And then he found it. An article from October 17th, 1956. Tragedy strikes. Woman found smiling in death. His fingers tightened around the brittle paper as he read. A woman named Lillian Moore had been found dead in her home, sitting upright in a wooden chair. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, but the details that stood out. Her mouth had been carved open into a permanent, unnatural grin. The town's police had ruled it a suicide, but locals didn't believe it. They whispered that Lillian had been obsessed with something, a ritual, a summoning, that she had called something into her home, and whatever had answered never truly left. The last line of the article sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Her neighbours reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to her death. They claimed to see a woman standing under the streetlights at night, a woman with a grin, too wide to be human. Ethan's stomach churned. He had seen her, and now she had seen him too. He spent the rest of the afternoon pretending everything was normal. He stopped by a coffee shop, forced himself to chat with the barista, walked aimlessly around town like he was just another resident enjoying a lazy weekend. But the feeling never left. The eyes. Even in broad daylight, Ethan felt them, watching, waiting. That night, he locked his doors, closed every window, drew the curtains. He left the lights on, kept his TV running for background noise. But around 2:47 a.m., the static began. His television screen flickered, the sound distorting into a low, warping hum. The lights dimmed. A slow, rhythmic scratching echoed from his bedroom window. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He didn't want to look. He knew what he would see. But some horrible instinct, some part of his mind that no longer felt like his own, forced him to turn his head. The curtains fluttered, though the window was shut, and behind them, just barely visible through the thin fabric, a grin, too wide, too wrong. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. And then, smile with me. The voice wasn't coming from the window. It was inside the room. Ethan's body locked in place. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as his heart slammed against his ribs. The voice, her voice, was no longer outside his window. It was here, in the room. The TV screen continued to flicker, the static warping into something unnatural. A sound like distorted laughter bubbling beneath the white noise. The air in the apartment felt heavier, as if it had thickened, pressing against his chest, making it impossible to move. Then the whisper came again. "Smile with me." Slowly, painfully slowly, Ethan turned his head toward the dark corner of the room, and he saw her. She wasn't standing by the window anymore. She was inside. Her impossibly wide grin gleamed in the dim light, her teeth too perfect, too sharp, too white. Her black eyes bore into him, hollow and endless. Her body was unnaturally still, as if she wasn't breathing, wasn't alive in the way humans were. And then she took a step forward. Not walked, slid. Her feet barely touched the ground, her movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet with its strings tangled. Ethan wanted to run, wanted to scream, but he couldn't, because something was changing. His lips twitched, his face muscles tightened involuntarily, his mouth, it was stretching, wider, too wide. A burning pain erupted at the corners of his mouth, as if invisible fingers were pulling them apart, forcing them into something unnatural. His reflection in the dark TV screen caught his eye, and what he saw made his stomach lurch. His own grin. It was spreading, inch by inch, curling higher than a human mouth should. His cheeks ached. His skin felt like it was tearing. "Smile with me." Her voice slithered into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts like barbed wire. Ethan's vision blurred. His body wasn't his anymore. His hands were limp at his sides, his legs unresponsive. Every muscle in his face strained against an unseen force, dragging his mouth into a twisted, horrifying parody of a smile. Then, a knock at the door. Loud, sudden. Everything stopped. The pressure on his face vanished. The static on the TV cut out, leaving the room in suffocating silence. Ethan blinked when he looked back toward the dark corner. She was gone. Another knock. This one softer, hesitant. Ethan staggered toward the door, his legs weak, his mind still fogged with horror. He hesitated before unlocking it, hands shaking. Mrs. Alder stood outside, wrapped in her shawl, her old blue eyes scanning his face. She didn't ask if he was okay. She already knew. "You saw her, didn't you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. His voice cracked. "I think she was in my apartment." Mrs. Alder exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. When she opened them, there was pity there. "She's marked you now." Ethan felt his stomach drop. What does that mean?" Mrs. Alder's face was grim. "She won't stop." Ethan's breath hitched. Mrs. Alder looked past him, into the apartment, as if she could still feel the presence lingering in the air. "She doesn't just want to be seen." Her voice was quieter now. "She wants you to smile back." Ethan's blood ran cold, because for a moment, when the thing was standing in his room, he had almost done just that, and a terrible thought struck him. What would have happened if he had? Ethan didn't sleep. Even after Mrs. Alder left, her words rattled inside his skull like a curse. "She's marked you now. She won't stop." He sat in his apartment, lights on, hands gripping the edge of his couch so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept his gaze away from the windows, away from the dark corners, away from his own reflection in the TV screen. He could still feel the ghost of that awful, forced smile on his face. He spent the rest of the way his skin had pulled, the way his muscles had fought against something unseen. Had he imagined it? No. She had been here, and she would come again. By morning, Ethan made a decision. He needed answers. Black Hollow wasn't a big town. People knew things. Even if they didn't talk about them openly, the truth was somewhere. He started with the library again. The librarian barely glanced at him as he dug back into the archives. 1956. Lillian Moore, the woman who smiled in death. He read the article again, over and over, trying to find something he had missed. Then he noticed a name. Detective Harold Grayson, the man who had investigated Lillian's death. A quick search revealed something interesting. Grayson had left the force abruptly after the case. No reason given. No record of where he went. But there was one more mention of him, buried in the town's records. An address. Ethan's hands tightened around the paper. He had a lead. The house was on the far edge of town, where the roads turned to dirt and the trees pressed in too close. It was isolated, forgotten. Ethan hesitated at the gate. The place looked abandoned. Shutters closed, yard overgrown, the front porch sagging like the house itself had grown tired of standing. But then the door opened. An old man stood in the doorway. Harold Grayson. His hair was thin and white, his face lined with deep-set wrinkles. His eyes, sharp, calculating, landed on Ethan like he had been expecting him. "You're the one she's after now, aren't you?" Ethan's mouth went dry. Grayson sighed, stepping aside. "Well, you came all this way. Might as well come in." The inside of the house was strange. Every mirror was covered. Every window sealed shut. The lights were dim, but candles flickered in every corner. And then Ethan saw them. The drawings, sketches, pinned to the walls, hundreds of them. And every single one was of her. The woman who smiles too wide. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Some drawings showed her standing under streetlights. Some showed her in dark corners, half hidden in shadow. And others, the worst ones, showed her grinning face up close, too wide, too sharp, wrong. Grayson watched him carefully. "You saw her, didn't you?" Ethan nodded, throat dry. Grayson exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Then you need to listen carefully, because if she set her sights on you, there's only one thing you can do." Ethan swallowed. "What?" Grayson's gaze was dark. "Whatever happens, don't smile back." Ethan felt a chill run through him. "What happens if I do?" Grayson hesitated. His jaw tightened. Then he turned and pointed to one last drawing on the wall. Ethan stepped closer, and his blood turned to ice. It wasn't a drawing. It was a photograph of a man sitting in a chair, mouth stretched too wide, frozen in a permanent, unnatural grin. His eyes, glassy, empty, stared forward, seeing nothing. "He smiled," Grayson said quietly, "and now he's hers." Ethan's knees felt weak. "She's not a ghost," Grayson continued. "Not a demon. She's something else, something old. No one knows where she came from, but we know what she wants." Ethan forced himself to speak. "What?" Grayson's face darkened. "She collects smiles." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Grayson gestured at the photograph. "She finds people, watches them, and she waits until the moment is right." Ethan's pulse pounded. "Right for what?" Grayson's eyes locked onto his, until they smiled back. Ethan's stomach twisted. He thought back to last night, the way his mouth had started to move against his will. She had been pulling him in. Grayson's voice was grave. "Once you smile, it's over. She takes it, takes you, leaves you frozen like that forever." Ethan felt sick. He had been so close, so damn close. Grayson studied him. "You're lucky. Most don't last this long." Ethan's breath hitched. "Then what do I do?" Grayson's jaw clenched. "I don't know." Ethan's heart sank. "But I do know this," Grayson continued. "The more afraid you are, the closer she gets. The more you think about her, the more real she becomes." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had been thinking about her all day. Grayson leaned in, voice a low whisper. "You need to stop feeding her, stop looking for her, forget her." Ethan swallowed hard, and then, from somewhere outside, a streetlight buzzed, flickered, died. Ethan's breath stopped. Grayson's face drained of colour. Slowly, he turned toward the window. Ethan followed his gaze. Outside, under the broken streetlight, she was there, smiling, watching, waiting. Ethan couldn't breathe. She stood just beyond the dying streetlight, her figure barely illuminated in the flickering glow. Her body was unnaturally still, her black eyes locked onto his. But it was her grin, that impossible, skin-splitting grin. Grayson grabbed Ethan by the wrist and yanked him back from the window. His grip was iron hard, his voice a sharp whisper. "Don't look at her." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "She's already seen me." Grayson's expression was grim. "That's not the problem. It's when you see her back." Ethan swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Grayson didn't answer. Instead, he moved swiftly through the house, double-checking the locks, drawing thick black curtains over every window. He had done this before. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to control the shaking in his hands. "How do we stop her?" Grayson turned to him, eyes dark. "You don't." Ethan paced the living room, adrenaline still pounding through his veins. "There has to be a way. If you've survived this long, you must know something." Grayson exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. "I know one thing." Ethan stopped. "What?" Grayson met his gaze. "She plays a game." A chill crawled up Ethan's spine. Grayson sat down heavily in his chair, eyes distant. "I've spent years trying to understand what she is, what she wants. She doesn't kill outright. She doesn't chase." Ethan frowned. "Then what does she do?" Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "She waits. She watches. She tests you." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Test me how?" Grayson leaned forward, his voice grave. "She'll appear more often now, closer. She'll whisper. She'll pull." His voice lowered. "And she'll try to make you smile. At first it's just a feeling, a twitch in your lips. But the more you fight it, the stronger she gets." Ethan shuddered. He had felt it, that unnatural pull. Grayson's eyes were haunted. "And if you ever smile back, really smile, you're hers." Ethan sat down hard on the couch. His whole body felt cold. "How do I make her stop?" Grayson sighed. "You don't. You endure." He gestured to the covered mirrors, the blacked-out windows. "You ignore her. You pretend she's not there. You train your mind to reject her." Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his skull. "And if I fail?" Grayson didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ethan had already seen the answer, in the photograph, in that frozen, stretched, unnatural grin. They sat in silence for hours. Ethan stared at the floor, his thoughts racing. His body was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. Then, sometime past 3 a.m., it happened. The lights dimmed. A familiar static hiss filled the air, like an old television tuning to a dead channel. Ethan's body tensed. Grayson's jaw tightened. "She's getting closer." A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. Ethan's breath hitched. It came from the front door. Grayson didn't move. "Don't answer it." The knocking stopped. Silence. Then a whisper. "Smile with me." Not from the door, from inside the house. Ethan's chest tightened. The voice was close. Too close. Grayson's fingers dug into the arm of his chair. "Ignore her." Ethan clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stare at the floor. His hands gripped his knees, his nails digging into his skin. The air in the room grew heavy, like the oxygen was being sucked away. Then, footsteps. Slow. Light. Bare feet padding across the floor. Ethan could see the movement in his peripheral vision. A figure standing at the edge of his sight, shifting slightly, watching. "Just a little smile," she whispered. A shadow moved. Ethan's throat tightened. She was standing right next to him. He could feel her presence, the weight of her stare, the unnatural stillness of her body. "I can make you happy." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't look. Don't move." The air grew colder. The silence stretched. Then, a new sound. A low, guttural laugh. Right next to his ear, something brushed against his shoulder. Fingers. Cold. Wrong. Ethan's body jerked. He almost turned. Almost saw her face. Number. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay still. Then, the sound stopped. The air lightened. The weight lifted. Ethan opened his eyes. The room was empty. She was gone. Ethan exhaled shakily, his whole body trembling. His shirt was damp with sweat. Grayson let out a slow breath. "She's playing with you now." Ethan swallowed hard. "She's testing your will," Grayson continued, "seeing how much she has to push before you break." Ethan ran a shaking hand through his hair. "How long does this last?" Grayson's expression darkened. "As long as you can resist." Ethan's stomach turned. He knew what Grayson meant. Eventually, everyone gives in. No one can resist forever, and she knows that. That's why she waits. That's why she smiles. Because in the end, she always wins. Ethan didn't go back to his apartment. He couldn't. He stayed with Grayson, the only person who understood what was happening. But even inside the old man's fortified home, he didn't feel safe, because now she was everywhere. Grayson grabbed Ethan by the wrist and yanked him back from the window. His grip was iron hard, his voice a sharp whisper. No matter how much he tried to ignore her, she made sure he knew she was there. At first, it was small things. The whispers, the faintest sound of laughter, a flicker in the corner of his eye. Then, it got worse. She was inside his dreams. Number not dreams. Because when he woke up, he still felt her hands on his skin. On the third night, Ethan finally collapsed from exhaustion. Sleep was restless, feverish. His body was too tired to fight it, and the moment his eyes shut, he was somewhere else. The world was dark, suffocating. He stood in a narrow hallway, the walls stretching endlessly on both sides. A single light bulb buzzed above him, casting flickering shadows. And then, at the end of the hallway, he saw her. The woman who smiles too wide. She stood in the darkness, body unnaturally still, her head slightly tilted. The hallway began to shrink. The walls closed in, and she started moving toward him. Not walking, gliding, faster, faster, faster. Ethan tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't open. Then she was inches away, her black eyes locked onto his, her two white teeth gleaming in the dim light. Then she whispered, slow and deliberate, "You're almost ready." Ethan woke up gasping. His body was cold, his skin covered in sweat. Grayson was staring at him from his chair. His face was grim. "She's inside now," he said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "Inside what?" Grayson's expression was dark. "Inside your head." The next morning, Ethan left. He had to. Something about the house felt wrong now, like she had infected it. The air was too thick. The shadows stretched too long. And worst of all, the mirrors were no longer covered. He didn't remember uncovering them, and neither did Grayson. But now, every single one reflected her. Every time Ethan walked past, his own face would be almost normal, until he blinked, and his reflection would be smiling, too wide, too sharp, and sometimes it wasn't his reflection at all. It was her, watching. Ethan ran. It didn't matter where he went. She was always there, in the grocery store, standing in the reflection of the freezer doors, on the empty streets, waiting beneath the flickering streetlights, in his car, smiling at him from the rearview mirror. Everywhere, Ethan barely ate, barely slept. His body felt heavy, his mind fractured. And the worst part, he could feel it now. The pull, it was getting stronger. Every time she appeared, every time her whisper slithered through his mind, he felt the urge to smile. The final night came faster than he expected. He had nowhere left to go. His own apartment was a death trap. Grayson's house was compromised. No hotel, no shelter, no light could keep her away. She had won. Ethan sat in his car, parked on the edge of town, staring blankly at the darkness ahead. The streetlight above him flickered. Then it went out. A familiar static filled the air, and he knew she was behind him. He didn't turn, didn't move, didn't breathe. Ethan. His body locked. You're ready now. The air turned ice cold. His skin tingled. His lips, they twitched. He clenched his fists. Number. But then, she touched him. A soft, feather-light brush against his shoulder. And he broke. His head turned, not by choice. And there she was, closer than ever. Face inches from his, her smile wider than should be possible. And Ethan. He smiled back, his lips curled, his face stretched. The pain was unbearable, like invisible hands were ripping his skin apart, tearing, splitting. He tried to stop, tried to fight, but it was too late. His body wasn't his anymore. His mind wasn't his anymore. All that remained was the smile. Ethan's face was frozen, his lips stretched into an impossible, agonizing grin. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he couldn't. His body wasn't his anymore. His muscles locked in place, his eyes wide, glassy, trapped. And she was laughing. Not a normal laugh, something wet, garbled, a sound that crawled under his skin and burrowed deep into his bones. She leaned in closer, her breath cold against his face. There you are. Ethan felt himself slipping, his thoughts unraveling, his soul peeling away like old wallpaper. No. This wasn't real. This wasn't. Something snapped. A memory. Grayson's voice, distant but sharp. She plays a game. But games can be broken. Ethan clung to those words, forcing them through the cracks in his mind. Ethan gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against her grip. And then, the smile broke. His lips snapped back, his jaw slackening. His body was his again. And she screamed. The world lurched. Darkness twisted around him, the air vibrating with something ancient and furious. She lashed out, fingers clawing, shadows writhing. But Ethan moved. He slammed his car door open, throwing himself onto the pavement. His limbs were weak, barely functional, but he ran. Behind him, she howled. The sound shattered streetlights, sent cracks through the asphalt. But Ethan didn't stop, didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until the world finally fell silent. Morning came. Ethan woke up in a hospital bed. A nurse stood beside him, checking his vitals. Her face was normal. No unnatural grin. No black eyes. He was alive. The police had found him unconscious on the side of the road, babbling about a woman who wasn't there. They thought he had suffered a psychotic break. But Ethan knew the truth. He had won, hadn't he? Days passed. The hospital discharged him. He went back to his apartment. Everything felt different. The world was brighter, louder, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as he brushed his teeth, his gaze flickered to the bathroom mirror. His own face stared back. Normal. No shadowy figures, no eerie grins. Just him. Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. Then, his reflection blinked, and he didn't. Ethan's breath caught. His reflection tilted its head, and slowly, so agonizingly slowly, it began to smile.